All right, all yours, Anna.
Thank you, Juliet. Welcome, everyone. We are really excited to have Tristan Claridge presenting today. And Tristan has been researching and applying social capital for over 20 years. He is the director of the Institute for Social Capital and the current president of the International Social Capital Association. Tristan is a geographer and environmental scientist with a passion for social processes and how social value is identified and communicated. He has a deep and grounded understanding of social capital and its application, having worked on the concept from theoretical and practical perspectives. He draws on lessons from economics, sociology, political science, psychology, urban planning, and any other discipline that contributes understanding to the concept. In addition to his practical work with the concept, he has been an active contributor to the academic debate about social capital and has written over 200 open access articles on social capital and related topics and is actively engaged in ongoing research. And today he's going to be presenting on reconnecting with the importance and value of social relationships. And so welcome, Tristan. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Anna, and thanks for that wonderful introduction. So great to see so many smiling faces. Some are familiar, and some people who I haven't met before. Great to be here, and great to share these ideas about social capital. So the title is Reconnecting the Importance and Value of Social Relationships, but honestly, it's a bit of a struggle doing so. The concept clearly has a need and there's a lot of interest in the concept, but I'm not sure it's quite performing its intended role as yet. So by way of an overview, it's clearly a very popular concept, and I'll communicate with you just how popular the concept actually is. But why is it popular? Why do so many people want to use this concept? What are they trying to do with it? What is it? What need is it fulfilling for them? And unfortunately, as I mentioned, it's a bit of a struggle. Why isn't it perhaps quite living up to these needs and fulfilling them? And how can we do better? And what is the way forward? And what I'll discuss today is grounded in the scholarly literature. So I'll share quotes that illustrate many of the points that I make. You know, I'm not the only person that's working on this, and there's lots of brilliant and accomplished scholars out there who have similar ideas. So I'll connect with that literature and share it with you as we go through. So the first thing, of course, we need to do is to establish what is social capital. I don't assume that everybody knows exactly what this is. Perhaps you've heard the term before, but you're not quite sure exactly what it is. So let's see what the prominent scholars say it is. And I'll start with a few popular definitions so we can see what we're dealing with. And the logical place to start is, of course, with Bob Putnam, who is perhaps the most famous of the social capital theorists. And his definition that is most commonly cited is features of social organization, such as networks, norms, and social trust that can facilitate coordination and cooperation for mutual benefit. And I included on this slide a number here. This is I did a survey of the literature in 2020. I randomly selected 250 peer-reviewed articles that have social capital in the title. And I looked for what definition of social capital was being used, and I found 21% of that sample was citing Putnam's definition. So what does this really mean? Essentially, we're saying that social capital is something that enables or facilitates pro-social action. You know, we can understand that we tend to be more pro-social towards our friends, that perhaps norms may encourage positive social actions, and that trust clearly is also really important. And these examples, networks, norms, and social trust, are really just examples that are given in this definition of features of social organization. So you might not be perfectly clear on what social capital is just yet from this. There's certainly, for me, there's some more questions that remain unanswered from having read just one simple definition like this. So let's see what else there is. Nan Lin defines social capital as resources embedded in one's social networks. And these are resources that can be accessed or mobilized through ties in these networks. So the word resources is a bit vague. I'm still not quite sure exactly what that means, but it could be things like power and influence that people have within their network. But some authors actually refer to physical assets, physical resources, more tangible things that can be mobilized within social networks. And Alejandro Portes talks about the ability to secure benefits, which is fairly broad, but again, focusing on the membership in social networks and other social structures. So one more, perhaps, just to get a different perspective. This is Norman Uphoff. This is very rarely cited in the literature, but there's an enormous amount of variation. Across those 250 articles I surveyed, I found 125 different definitions. So very few of them are commonly cited in the literature. But this definition focuses on these various types of assets, whether they be social, psychological, cultural, cognitive, institutional, that increase the amount or perhaps the probability of mutually beneficial cooperative behavior. So I don't particularly like the use of a list in a definition like this, because it always makes me think, well, what else is there that is relevant? And surely there's something that all of these things have in common that could be the basis for what we're actually talking about. But this certainly gives us quite a few ideas about what social capital is. So if we break this down, clearly the core intuition of social capital is that social relationships are valuable, and that they can be an asset that enables positive and productive action. So in a general sense, then, that it's the ability or capacity or potential for people to be able to cooperate and work together and to interact and exchange positively. And it's an important form of capital. We can invest in positive working relationships. We can create groups and organizations. We can establish constructive and inclusive institutions. And it relates to environments where people are inclined to cooperate, to collaborate, to engage in pro-social action, to be helpful, to be giving, to be caring, all of those kinds of things. And it's a form of capital. We refer to it as a form of capital because it represents a vital stock for future benefits. So what this really then means is, well, relationships matter. Social interaction, social support, belonging, these are all important. And people are not just interested in themselves, and pro-social action is clearly beneficial. Now, these are hardly startling discoveries, but in the modern age, these are evidently ones that need to be declared. 200 years ago, a concept like social capital would have been completely unnecessary. And certainly when you think about most traditional societies, this sort of concept would have seemed nonsensical, because this idea, being pro-social, being collective, acting in the interests of a collective, engaging in social interaction and seeking social support and belonging, all of these things are fundamental to what it means to simply live and exist in those societies. But by the end of the 20th century, apparently we needed it. And I think really this is a bit of an indictment on modern society, that we need to come up with a term or a concept to be able to communicate something that should be so inherently part of what it means to be human. So I said this concept's popular. Let's have a look at just how popular it actually is, because it's really quite striking. Some have claimed that it's one of the most popular concepts in the social sciences, and has even spread into the physical sciences. And it's also made that difficult transition beyond academia and is quite commonplace in politics and business and community development. And it's even entering into popular language now. We're hearing it with increasing frequency. So when I did some survey of the literature in 2021, I found that there was about 52,000 scholarly articles with social capital in the title. And just a week ago, I redid this same search of Google Scholar, and I found there's now 141,000 scholarly articles. So we've seen nearly a threefold increase in the space of just 3 years. And to put this into context, in the period since social capital became popular, so say since 1990, a concept like trust only has 127,000 publications in the title. Something like social networks has only about 46,000. A really popular concept like globalization only has 93,000. A concept like organizational culture only has not even 30,000. And a really important concept, what I thought was important concept, like social norms, has less than 9,000. So social capital outstrips all of these by far. And I think the claims that it's one of the most popular concepts in the social sciences is probably quite accurate. And if we see the graph and the change, the rapid growth in publications in social capital over time, we can see that it's steepening and accelerating. I've just marked on this graph a few of the key publications of social capital, and particularly that period in time when the World Bank was most interested in social capital, which was up until around about 2003 or perhaps 2004. And that was really the very early days of social capital. And really, since this graph, this only goes to about 2020, we've seen at least a doubling, if not even tripling, of the number of publications that now exist on the concept. So we've certainly seen rapid growth in popularity, from obscurity in 1990, just a handful of scholarly publications in total. Virtually no one had heard of the concept at all within academia or outside of it. And now it's spread to virtually everywhere and even into popular vocabulary. So clearly there's a need for this concept. I think that's very obviously demonstrated. To the people who use it, it clearly has value or utility or purpose. There's something in particular that they want it to do. And I think for the most part that it's something that it can communicate, or it can address or prioritize or perhaps solve, that was not possible without this concept. This concept is a way of communicating something or addressing something. It does have some sort of a purpose. Otherwise, surely people wouldn't be using it, certainly so many people. So what is this? What is this? Why is it so popular? And let's have a look at some of the ideas that exist in the literature. And I particularly like this quote from Michael Woolcock. He says that social capital has such widespread resonance because it provides a name for an intuitive transcultural recognition that we are inherently social beings, and this has significant consequences for a host of other substantive issues we care about. And I hear this from people all the time as the reason why they're interested in social capital, and it reflects my own interests in social capital when I first became interested in it over 20 years ago, that I felt like we needed to focus on why people are social and those benefits that come from being social. And there's a few other ideas as well. The concept of social capital draws attention to the effects and consequences of human sociability and connectedness and their relations to the individual and social structure. And this is something really that's been overlooked and undervalued, and potentially the concept of social capital can re-emphasize or reprioritize those positive aspects of sociability and the processes of socialization. So perhaps we can get some insights into why it was needed and perhaps when it became popular. And particularly, why did it emerge around the 1990s? And one idea is that it was corrective to the idea that there is no such thing as society and Thatcherism. And although Thatcher didn't actually mean what it sounds like this says, she did emphasize individual responsibility and related ideas of individualism and self-reliance that tend to undermine collective action and collective interests. But there's other ideas as to why the concept of social capital was needed and emerged when it did. And particularly, there's a lot of interest in it being a response to economic theories and policies of the 1980s. And perhaps it being a critique or in response to the narrow analytic perspectives that came to dominate the neoclassical school of economic theory around that time. And clearly, it's not just within academia, it's also perhaps neoliberalism in general greatly contributed to social capital's popularity. I think this quote is quite revealing. It says that it, as in neoliberalism, has constrained the latter, as in the individual, to give their lives an entrepreneurial form, subordinated social intercourse to economic criteria, and neutered the previous structures and institutions of political representation. The ideology of self-responsibility has been especially significant since it deprives the citizens of their collective capacities, agency, and culture, and appears to value consumption above all else, places the merits of success and the burden of failure on isolated individuals, and suggests that the resolution of every social problem requires the further individualization and financialization of social provision and intercourse. So clearly the concept was needed, but what can the concept do? Perhaps it can reprioritize and revitalize how we think about the multiple facets of human economic activity. It could provide a more holistic frame for the study of social action. And it could highlight the significance of relational social factors beyond under-socialized views. And they're talking specifically about the relationship with a certain form of economic theorizing and that relationship with perhaps the rest of the social sciences. So we can ask this question, is it fulfilling this need? And as I've already alluded to, too frequently, no, it really does fail to fulfill its promises and its potential. And I've identified quite a common trend of the way in which the concept is used. It tends to be adopted to solve certain problems or needs, but then be applied in methodologically familiar ways without clarity or really any theoretical foundations that ultimately cause it to be ineffective at solving those initial problems. And all too often the concept is then abandoned by that particular scholar and left further damaged. And all of this too often really comes down to those uncertain theoretical foundations. And despite years of scholarly work, we're still not really quite sure what it is, how it works, what it does. I've talked with hundreds and hundreds of people about social capital, and uncertainty is a common theme across that. And certainly this is supported in the literature. There's claims that confusion and contradiction continue to reign in much of the literature. And Michael Woolcock said that if social capital can be rational, pre-rational, or even non-rational, then what is it not? And this highlights these uncertainties that exist in the theory. This quote also talks about this, that it's made up of components that do not hang together in a coherent or productive way. And it's not like we haven't been working on this for 3 decades. So what's actually gone wrong? And I think most people would say that it was hoped that an evidence-based approach would overcome these conceptual and theoretical weaknesses. Some authors have expressed a desire to not get bogged down in the theory, but simply go out there and measure it and observe it in the real world, engage in empirical inquiry, and that evidence-based approach would eventually overcome its weaknesses. But logically, I guess, in retrospect, those very same weak theoretical foundations frequently undermine the validity of any empirical inquiry, and the critical literature on social capital has grown in parallel with the concept's rapid rise in popularity. And it's not going particularly well. And I think this slide summarizes these key criticisms. Ben Fine, the London School of Economics, is perhaps one of the most vocal critics on it. And he claims that these following criticisms, which I won't go into in too much detail, he claims that they're now recognized and accepted at a level of 99% or more. So there's things in here, about it being chaotic, about it crudely simplifying, about it misunderstanding both social and capital, about it being complicit in mainstream economics and what he describes as economics imperialism and rational choice theory, about it neglecting, power and conflict and so many other things. So there's a lot of criticisms here, and I think we need to acknowledge, for one, that we're not talking about one unified body of literature when it comes to social capital. It's incredibly vast and incredibly varied. But generally speaking, these statements do ring true for a disturbingly large proportion of the literature. So then, as a conclusion, is it fulfilling the needs? In some ways, yes. It is moving the needle. People who are bringing up these ideas are making it more acceptable to bring up these ideas and to challenge particularly the orthodoxy of neoclassical economic theorizing and individualism. However, of course, as I've mentioned, it's often difficult to understand and communicate. It's not grounded in logic and theory very often. It's often embedded with very questionable assumptions, particularly a lot of the measurement methods are a bit questionable. It's really quite poorly suited to theory development, the way that it's been currently applied. And often it's unclear what the policy recommendations actually are. So is it fulfilling needs? Well, not really. But remember, scholars want to reprioritize the importance of social factors and processes and move past individualism that has been under-socialized and provide a more holistic frame for the study of social action. So why would scholars use this concept then? It's difficult, it's complex, few people really know what it is, it's poorly defined, heavily criticized, and yet they still do. So clearly they still believe that there's something here that they can use to reprioritize these issues that they're looking to focus on. But we can explore a bit more about what's going wrong and why it isn't fulfilling these needs. So why isn't it? Well, let's have a look. So really, it's old wine in a new bottle. Alejandro Portes pointed out that the term does not embody any idea really new to sociologists, but simply recaptures an insight that was present from the very beginning of the discipline. And as Adam Smith well understood, economic life is deeply embedded in social life, and it cannot be understood apart from the customs, morals, and habits of the society in which it occurs. So the concept isn't new to humans, but the need to communicate it is clearly now required. This means that we did understand it, but then we lost it, and apparently now need to come up with a concept to communicate it. So perhaps we can understand who started understand this more by who started it and when it was first used. And I created this simple changing graph here to illustrate which topic areas the publications on social capital were. And it starts in 93 and runs through. Let me just press play on this. And we can see that it's really sociology and economics, and it's an interplay between particularly those two disciplines in the early years, and then things start to change over time. So I'll let this run out so that you can see how things have changed as the number of publications increase. Perhaps you might be able to spot your own area of interest or subject area in the list and how it perhaps moves up or down over time. The ones that are marked in blue end up being in the top 5. This ends in 2020. The ones in orange end up between positions 5 and 10. And the remaining green ones are the ones that end up placing quite highly. Of course, there's hundreds of different topic areas, and there might be a lot of overlap and duplication of these topic areas. These are from the Web of Science categories. So we'll just let this play out so you can see how it changes over time. Sociology, economics has already dropped down to 3rd here by 2012. Sociology is still holding top spot, but it won't. My own areas of interest here, environmental science, urban planning, environmental studies, these are all quite prominent in the area of social capital. But really, business and management are really particularly strong. So what we can conclude from this really is that it's all about the relationship to economics. And this shouldn't be surprising considering social capital. Well, we've embraced an economic concept to try and communicate this thing that we think is so important to communicate. And so that's what I'm saying. It really exists because of this relationship between economics and, we could say, sociology, but I think perhaps it's relevant to draw a line between economics and the rest of the social sciences and just simply describe it as non-economics. So what we really need to do is dig into a bit of the economic thinking that led to this. What changed? We know that from Adam Smith in those early days, there was no need for a concept like social capital. It would have had limited value since the related ideas were part of the way we understood the world and how we acted in it. But things changed, and we need to explore this a little bit. Don't worry, I'm not an economist. I'm not an economic historian. I'm a geographer and a environmental scientist. So this we'll try and not get too heavy into this economic theory, but it is relevant to bring up that the marginalist revolution of the 1870s was really a significant change in the way in which economic theorizing occurred that eventually led to 6 really fundamental changes in economics. Not right away, and that it probably started as early as the 1930s or 1830s or 1840s, but it eventually led to the adoption of methodological individualism, the depiction of the individual as rational utility maximizer, the depiction of the individual as asocial, and the removal of the social from economics, the removal of the historical dimension of economics, increasingly deductivist and ahistorical approaches to theory, and a narrow redefinition of economics as the science of prices and market. And the next major change in economics occurred in the formalist revolution after World War II, which involved a preference for a form of economic argument over content and an increasing reliance on mathematical modeling. And finally, the new classical economics of the 1970s, which set the scene for the emergence of the concept of social capital in the 1980s and the rise to popularity in the 1990s. But we need to explore this a little bit more, because I don't think I've really explained how these changes in economic thought actually led to the concept of social capital. So after the marginalist revolution, the economic became synonymous with rationality, and increasingly the social was the residual non-rational portion. And this process was driven by the aim of economics as building an exact science, but it took time for this technical apparatus that's now associated with neoclassical economics to become both perfected and fully accepted within the discipline itself. So I'm talking about the increasingly formalistic, axiomatic, and deductive analytical framework that is associated with the narrow form of neoclassical economics that has become so incredibly popular. Ben Fine described this process as an implosion, for it involved making whatever assumptions were necessary to be able to derive meaningful results. So this included assumptions such as fixed preferences, single motivation, fixed goods, and even technical assumptions such as there being no externalities, increasing returns, concavities, and imperfect competition. And by the Second World War, the marginalist principles had been developed, accepted, and professionally adopted within economics. All of the principles on which the formalist revolution was built, such as individual optimization and equilibrium, were really children of the marginal revolution of the 1870s. However, for the first half of the 20th century, microeconomics and its implosion of technique, as I've just described, was only a very small part of economics as a discipline. There was also macroeconomics, applied economics, institutional economics, and a range of more inductive and applied fields all existed within economics at that time. And in the early 20th century, certainly, microeconomics was perceived as a totally inadequate system for systemic analysis. However, the collapse of the post-war boom and the stagflation of the 1970s saw microeconomics gaining primacy in the discipline and has come to dominate economic thinking since. And as mentioned previously, that this dominance of thinking has spread far beyond the discipline, beyond academia, and has permeated into modern culture and life. And this change in attitude within economics has highlighted by the following quote. In 1945, or in fact in 1950, if you had seriously proposed any of the ideas and policies in today's standard neoliberal toolkit, you would have been laughed off stage and sent to an insane asylum. So such is the change in economic thinking in that period, that hence by the 1980s, a concept such as social capital was really required. But of course, not all scholars wanted social capital to achieve the same things. Now, there's many possible uses for a concept. It can be a tool for many purposes. And for some, it was used as a tool to expand the technical apparatus associated with neoclassical economics into the rest of the social sciences. For others, it was perhaps a way to resolve that same technical apparatus, to bring it back in the social. For others, it was a way to appear scientific by aligning with economics, which was perceived as a rigorous science. For others, it was just purely a way to get attention and a way to get published. I think we need to acknowledge that. And for others, it presented different framing. So each of these then has some significance. According to Ben Fine, an expansion represents a colonization. Resolving that the technical apparatus perhaps could be described as heterodoxy within economics. It's certainly not one narrow unified discipline. There's lots of different ideas, and heterodoxy challenges many of those core ideas of neoclassical economics. Appearing to be scientific could be described as economics imperialism, the imperialism of economics being pushed upon the rest of the social sciences, perhaps. Getting attention, Ben Fine has a term hackademia, hack academia, poor scholarship, to describe what may be going on there. And potentially different framing could be transformative. We may be able to reprioritize the importance of social factors and processes if we can frame it in a way that allows that to occur. So let's explore each of these, because certainly the literature is far from unified, and it's worth touching on all of these possible uses of the concept. So the colonization idea, this is really Ben Fine argued that it's reductionist to the individual, to utility maximization, and to universal categories. The conclusion being that it's not an expansion through economic considerations, but a reduction to economic theory. And it could be described as a Trojan horse for economic imperialism. But clearly, this is not the only way in which the concept is understood, and we need to appreciate that only some of the work on social capital is attempting to use it in this kind of way. But what does colonization look like? Well, it's anything that perpetuates and reinforces the limitations or shortcomings of neoclassical economic theory and methodology being applied to an understanding of social life. We're not going to go through this in detail. This should be pretty obvious. It's the technical apparatus of neoclassical economics, methodological individualism, rational choice theory, equilibria as an organizing concept, and so on and so forth. These slides will be available if you want to look at this in more detail. So as I mentioned, another possibility is that it could be corrective. But unfortunately, quite often it corrects the asocial of neoclassical economics without much of a deviation of those axioms. And I think this is really quite understandable considering the paradigm or the episteme of the time. There was a strong belief in being scientific and objective, that this was what was required to be done. But the conclusion is that this tends to underperform. It generates some new knowledge, perhaps it moves the needle a bit, but it tends to actually reinforce the problem. And this is explained by this statement that the reduced and abstracted conception of human experience cannot be the starting point for a meaningful approach to social capital, because modifying Homo economicus, that is the neoclassical view of what humans are, is essentially delegitimizes the concept, creating confusion and contradiction. So for this is really unacceptable for some people. They claim that conceptualizations that start with methodological individualism and then try to add back in the social are unacceptable and ultimately ineffective. It can also be a tendency for some scholars to try to gain legitimacy or significance from wrapping social issues in the language of economics. And I saw this a lot during my postgraduate studies. There would be sociologists, professors in the sociology department having animated arguments in the hall over the rigor of research methods, just about coming to blows over whether or not you should do research qualitatively or quantitatively. And very commonly there was arguments on the quantitative side, arguments about the scientific nature and the need to be objective and empirical in these studies. And certainly economics often presents itself as being in possession of superior theories and methods. There's a widespread belief that it's more scientific. There was a 2005 study found that most economic graduates at top-ranking US universities strongly agreed with the statement that economics is the most scientific of the social sciences. So this is a view that is quite pervasive, and it's often expressed by economists themselves. Edward Lazier, for example, described how economics is scientific. It follows the scientific method of stating a formal refutable theory, testing the theory and revising the theory based on evidence. However, there's actually a growing recognition that the economic approach to behavior is not a scientific approach, and it's actually unscientific because it ignores observed behavior and makes assumptions on a theoretical basis alone. And even Edward Lazier admitted that the weakness of economics is that to be rigorous, simplifying assumptions must be made that constrain the analysis and narrow the focus of the researcher. And this is an interesting quote from Baldwin. He really doesn't mince words. I'm not sure I completely agree with this, but he states that in our society, it is the scientist who has displaced the priest as the moral exemplar, and the person who keeps humanity in touch with the something beyond us, the really real. This explains the desperate anxiety of numerous disciplines, including economics, to be seen as scientific. It becomes particularly dangerous when combined with intellectual and spiritual arrogance. So there's certainly an increasing recognition that classical economics is disconnected from reality and the spirit of scientific inquiry. So scholars who use social capital to align with economics and to appear scientific are really engaging in hubris. It seems unlikely this approach would help to reprioritize the importance of sociability. But of course, we need to continue to acknowledge that the discipline of economics is incredibly broad, and I presume these comments from these scholars applies really just to the core of neoclassical economic theorizing in particular. But the voices expressing these views are getting louder, and some are actually even coming from the core of academics as well. So as I mentioned, we need to acknowledge it could be used to get published, simply to get attention. And undoubtedly, that's the case for some scholars. Often the lack of theoretical foundations makes this quite easy because academics are able to put together a study, not engage too much with the theory, put it together, put it out there, get it published. It's very difficult to challenge social capital through the peer review process because who really knows what it is? So it's a bit of the Wild West out there. Anything goes, and it's very difficult to be critical of what is good scholarly work and what isn't. And as I mentioned previously, Ben Fine calls this hack academia or hackademia. But the use of social capital can be transformative and reprioritizing, but what does this actually look like? So Ben Spies-Butcher talks about it being part of a trend to move away from conventional reductivist and objectivist methods, and how social capital perhaps could be an analytical tool to consider both social and economic functioning in their analysis. Of course, it's not just one thing, but surely we can do better. These sort of approaches are in the literature, but they're difficult to identify. I couldn't easily point you towards any single publication that I would consider to be particularly transformative. So it's quite elusive. So how can we do better? That's what this is all about. We want to do something with social capital. We want it to be more effective. What can we do? And I think the short answer is not colonization. We unfortunately lack the conceptual tools to make and support the transformative approaches. And this is because most of the conceptual approaches in the social capital literature are either explicitly or implicitly based on rational choice theory or game theory or other theories from economics that are based on reductionism and individualism and all the other things that we've been discussing. And there's a general lack of social theory in social capital, which is clearly what is required. Because when you think about social capital, it's fundamentally about human action and the nature of human experiences that influence the nature of that action. So clearly it requires a strong action theoretical foundation that is social, not individualistic in its nature. And this is not thoroughly developed social capital at this time, as I mentioned, but there certainly are. And I want to continue to acknowledge that there are some excellent treatments in the literature, but they're not mainstream and they are very difficult to identify. And really, there's no shortage of theoretical and philosophical approaches across the social sciences that could be readily applied to social capital. And in this struggle to reconnect with the importance of sociabilities, and social relationships, it's clearly far from one. We've clearly a very long way from having achieved this. So in terms of the way forward, we need to look deeply into the theoretical foundations and the conceptual approaches of social capital, or the lack of such foundations. We need to ask those difficult questions, challenge the approaches that exist, explore the ontological foundations of different approaches. We need to challenge the assumptions that are embedded in many of these approaches. For example, we can't just let it go that we're not quite sure what resources are. We need to explore what that really means. We need to be quite specific about it. We need to develop the ontological foundations of that. We need to be clear about what it does. We can't continue to use the complexity and the interdisciplinary nature of social capital as an excuse for poor scholarship. We need to find a way to challenge the ideas that are unhelpful for prioritizing the importance of social relationships and pro-sociality. And we need to continue to acknowledge that continued empiricism on weak theoretical foundations is unlikely to solve these problems. And to put this into perspectives, in that survey of the literature that I did, about 75% of those empirical studies were quantitative. So there's a huge amount of empiricism going on very weak theoretical foundations. It's very difficult to build theory with quantitative methodologies. We need to acknowledge that these are problems and we need to do something about it rather than just continuing to ignore it. So can we do better? What does it actually look like in tangible, concrete ways? Well, we need to connect with the deeper meaning of being social and what it means to engage in positive social action. We need to base it on the logic of capital and how investments can create a stock of future benefits and returns. For many of the definitions and conceptual approaches to social capital, it's really not clear how it's a form of capital at all. It's not consistent with the logic of capital, and it's actually not really clear what it does at all, let alone being consistent with any kind of logic. We need to incorporate the complexity of human experience, rationality and reasoning. There's been a tendency to focus only on means-end forms of rationality, which is consistent, of course, with neoclassical economics. But humans experience other forms of reasoning and rationality, and it's important to bring those into our understanding of human experience. Otherwise, our theoretical foundations will continue to be incomplete. We need to appreciate how different actors, individuals, organizations, and coordinating institutions all play important but different roles in social capital and in shaping the nature of pro-social action. We need to appreciate that social capital is not just one thing that does one thing. No other form of capital is one thing. Physical capital is a car and a truck and a factory and a laptop, many different things, but they all have things in common. Human capital is also many different things. Natural capital is also many different things. We need to appreciate that the potential for one kind of social action does not necessarily mean there's a potential for other kinds of social action as well. And also, very importantly, we need to appreciate that not everyone has the same access to social capital. Every single person is different and experiences their social position differently. And that can be based on a very wide range of criteria: age, race, gender, socioeconomic status, education level, memberships in organizations, and on and on and on. There's so many things that can influence the ability to access and use social capital for an individual. Sounds pretty difficult, but perhaps achievable. And here is a starting point that I've worked on. This is from my new guide on social capital. This is Social Capital in Practice that has just been published. And it doesn't solve all of the problems, but it lays out a logic framework for social capital that is capable of incorporating diverse, rich theories across the social sciences. There's a place in here for sociology, for psychology, anthropology, and many more, including classical economics. It does all of the things I mentioned on the previous slide. It's very clear about the logic of capital, that it's a process that creates a stock. This is what social capital is, that capacity, that ability, that potential that produces a flow. And that flow may mobilize or activate or enhance or transform other forms of capital. It may be, the actions of individuals such as cooperation, or it might be giving or helping or sharing or social support, reciprocity. And these can contribute to future benefits or returns, whether it be innovation and creativity or resilience or economic development or public health. There's a wide range of different things that this can contribute to. And the potential itself has both individual and collective properties. I won't get into this in too much detail, but this is a framework effectively for how we might start thinking about using social capital in more transformative ways to inform the way in which we do things, to re-emphasize the importance of social relationships and pro-sociality, which is what we've been talking about throughout this entire presentation, as really the reason why we're interested in this concept of social capital and why we need something like this to reprioritize it. So by way of summary, clearly it's a very important conceptual tool that can be used for many different purposes. Many of them are not terribly helpful in achieving the things we want it to achieve. But what it can do is provide a framework for understanding why and how people collaborate, interact positively, and work together. It can allow us to communicate this to decision makers and policy makers. It can allow us to be more purposeful and deliberate in our activities, to emphasize and accentuate those things that we care about. It can allow people, teams, organizations, projects to communicate, to be more effective, productive, and successful. But of course, it continues to be a struggle to recognize and reprioritize the importance of pro-social action, which is really ongoing. This is a work that there's a lot of work that needs to be done to continue to find a transformative way to use the concept of social capital moving forward. So this slide deck is available if anyone wants to dig into all of the references that I've used. Of course, it's far too small to read because there's so very, very many of them. This is extensively based on the literature and the work that's been done across virtually all of the social sciences. So yeah, very open for questions and discussion.
That's great. Shall we stop sharing the slides so we can see ourselves in the grid?
Sure thing.
There we are. Wow, that was amazing. So much to talk about. And I never like to be the first one, and I always like to be the fourth one. So that means that Cheryl and Hal are going to make it easy for me to be number 4. So Cheryl, go to it.
I have a question. I once read about an organization, I don't know how it's operating right now, but what it was is people who had a skill, like an accountant, or somebody was a lawyer, or somebody was a gardener, or whatever, they would get on a shared resource where they would do gardening for somebody that needed gardening in exchange for somebody else who could do babysitting. See what I'm saying? So they were exchanging services would that be an example? I mean, an actual example, not the definitions and stuff, but an example of using social capital?
Yes. Yeah, I'd say it would be. So the way that I would describe that is that the act of sharing, or the act of engaging in social action, the fact that they went and did some gardening and they exchanged it for something else, that is an outcome of social capital. That is an outcome of the potential to be able to do that. And to be able to do that, you need to have social connections. You need to know people. You need to be able to get in touch and to understand what their needs are to be able to meet those needs. So that's the first part. You need the opportunity. But you also need what I would describe as the predisposition, or the inclination to want to go and do it, to be interested in engaging in the exchange or the interaction, or whatever the outcome of social capital we're interested in. And so, yes, absolutely. And I think that's the sort of thing that we all want more of in our communities and in our society. We want people to be able to identify those opportunities to help each other, to engage in mutually beneficial actions. And so we want more opportunities, and we want people to be more inclined to do it, to want to do it. And that's what social capital can potentially emphasize, that very idea.
Yeah, Hal.
Yeah, I've been jotting things in the chat about how the first question is, whose social capital? Is there something contradictory to the idea of capital if nobody owns it? So if you talk about the social, a company can try to create social capital, but they can't really own it, right? Unless it's some kind of social capital I don't understand. And one of the things that seems most easy to think about, like accumulating and moving around social capital, is the transfer of knowledge from one generation to another. The adults, preparing children for adulthood and economic life, and hopefully the children, as they grow up, taking care of the adults as they become too old to take care of themselves. That would be a sort of exchange that we would like to see between generations of social capital. You got...
Yeah, so I think there's two parts to that question. The first one is, who can own it, or who does own it? And it's fairly commonly accepted that social capital has both individual and collective properties, and we can understand that to some extent I can own to some degree my social capital, because I can go out and I can make friends, I can meet people, I can do favors for people, I can develop goodwill, I can develop a stronger reputation, and I can leverage that for future benefit. So there is some level of ownership at the individual level, and it's the same at the collective level. An organization can do all the same kinds of things, and there is a level of control and ownership over that potential that they produce. But when you think about where social capital resides, that issue of ownership becomes a little bit more challenging, because my social capital exists in what my friends think of me. Did they think that I have done favors for them, that I've developed goodwill, that I'm trustworthy? That's where it actually resides. And so it challenges the idea of being able to own social capital. This then moves on to the second part of the question. Does capital need to be owned? Is that a fundamental requirement of what capital is? And clearly, the classical meaning of capital has shifted and adjusted and effectively expanded over time. The introduction of a concept like human capital shifted the very narrow classical definition of what capital is. Same with natural capital. It shifted and expanded what the definition of capital is, and social capital has done much the same kind of thing. Some people in the literature talk about capital, social capital, being a metaphor for capital, not actually capital. It's capital-like. But to me, the core aspect of capital that social capital is consistent with is that you can invest in it to produce a stock that can produce a future benefit or return. And the ownership issue is not quite such an important consideration for me.
Yeah. Chip.
And I guess my question is one I'm still lurking toward, because I want to make certain David went forth. And, this is also my question will maybe set up what he will ask. And that is, having studied with Bob Putnam and worked with him forever, and having worked with him quite recently, my question is, why focus on the economic side of what is essentially, in the work that I do as a peace builder, a social, political, sociological, psychological idea? And what we're finding is that we don't worry much about the kinds of issues you raise, which are important. I don't know Ben Fine's work. I'll have to go read it. But what we're finding is that the absence of social capital is important in two ways. First, it is part of the lack of trust, the lack of social cohesion in countries like mine, and I would assume yours as well. But the second thing that Putnam doesn't get at, and that David does, is that social capital in an interdependent world is the social capital that brings people to cooperate with each other more. And it feels to me that economists don't get at that, but I watch the business folks go up in number of citations in your thing. And I suspect if you went and looked at what's coming out of the Harvard or Stanford business schools, you would find more useful ways of approaching social capital. So, my question is, if you hadn't focused on economics, but had focused on sociology or social psychology, I wouldn't say political science, which is my field, would you have found different things? And sorry to have rambled.
No, that's fine. So I'm not sure. I focused on economics as being the reason why the concept exists and the reason why it perhaps isn't as transformative as it could be, because of the desire for so many non-economists to align with forms of economic thinking. And this is something that James Coleman, Bob Putnam, they've all done this to a fairly large extent. They've made explicit reference to rational choice theory, to game theory, to these kinds of reductionist and individualistic kind of theories. And so I would love to see psychology, social psychology, sociology, rich sociological theories dominating the social capital literature as providing the explanation for why people do the things that they do. But they're not there. They are there, but they're very difficult. That's that stuff that's very difficult to identify. It's obscured. And to some extent, I think the reason is to get attention, to appeal to economics, to appeal to decision makers. All of that was stripped away. No one particularly wanted to talk about concepts like habitus, Bourdieu's concept of human experience, or life world, or these kind of rich sociological perspectives of human experience, because it may detract from the appeal of the concept altogether, which is trying to really align with economic thinking. And Bourdieu is very, very commonly cited in the literature, but his underlying theories of habitus and his rich sociology is almost never present in those theories of social capital. So I'm not sure if I've exactly answered your question. I think that I've tried to lay out what is in the literature, which to me isn't great, and what could be in the literature if we were to engage with richer sociological theories.
Yeah, so it was a great talk, and it really aligns with everything that I've read on the topic. And I think that, as you have said, the main culprit is that basically social capital is economic thinking trying to recover from its own deficiencies, its own handicap. And I would really wonder, since we know all about economic imperialism spreading into sociology and all these other disciplines, that if you were to redo your animated graph where you see that social capital is being used, mostly in sociology, and broke that down, I'm betting that it would be mostly, the brands of sociology that have been invaded by economic imperialism, and so also for all the other disciplines. So this is really, the fundamental problem here is that social capital is tied to the entire economic paradigm. And so if we wanted to get beyond that, we'd want to get beyond the whole economic paradigm or the whole neoclassical paradigm. So then the question becomes, what does that mean? And as you just alluded to, it means like what I call diffuse pluralism. Like there's 1,000 different flowers blooming out there, but not much of an integrative framework for tying them together. So you get, the rich social sciences, but that does lack integration, which is one reason why neoclassical economics seems so appealing in the first place. So I that's more of a statement than a question. And maybe I'll pass to Kathleen, and then next time I'll come back with a question. But you're welcome to comment on my statement.
Yeah, I would like to comment on it because I think Ben Fine calls for social capital to be abandoned as is inadequate, ineffective, just wholesale abandonment of the concept. I acknowledge all of the criticisms he makes, but I fall on the side of let's persist with this concept, but let's change the way in which we conceptualize and we theorize it. And so I think that when you talk about the need to have a framework to put these different pieces together, and particularly to encourage and embrace pluralism, to me, social capital has that potential when we understand it as this potential for positive social action in a broad kind of way. When we can engage with the logic of what capital is and how it does, when we can be clear about what it does, when we can start to say, well, this potential is a lot of different things. It relates to various forms of reasoning and rationality. It relates to potentially psychological processes as well as evolutionary processes, as well as, there's a lot of different things. And this is where the pluralism can come in, and there can be a fertile ground for exploring those multiple modes of reasoning that can contribute towards the potential for pro-social action.
Well, I mean,
so I'm a bit of a convert. I think it's got potential.
Well, I use it informally all the time. I mean, the concept of multiple forms of capital, and the list typically includes 6 or 8. That's intuitive and useful. Money plus much more. So I'm not actually being militant about not using the concept at all, FYI. And there's just many languages out there, basically intellectual frameworks out there, and neoclassical economics is hands down the dominant one. So if you're going to speak that lingo, then I think it would be an essential term if we're going to work within that vocabulary, I guess. And then we could also explore vocabularies in which, as you said it beautifully. I mean, 100 years ago, it would have been just incomprehensible because this was already embedded in the way people thought about society. They thought about society as an organism, and so on. So, but it would be nice then to go back to that vocabulary, and develop them both. I mean, doesn't have to be exclusive. Anyhow, Kathleen, were you the?
I am the next person, and this conversation is so rich and complex, and it's sprouting so many arms as people keep on talking that it's hard for me to hold on to my original thoughts and comments, but I'll kind of plunge in. from, well, it picks up on the idea that you mentioned, Tristan, that part of the definition of social capital is that it is a stock that can be invested in, or you can invest in something and create social capital. And I think that's a really interesting concept. You know, my background is in mental health and the soft science of psychology. But I know that I got a lot more interested in economics when the measuring tool, the ability to measure subjective well-being was developed and could be applied to research. And so it was at that point that you could compare different locations, different countries, how different groups of people live, where you could have this that was valid in terms of measures of subjective well-being that compared how people were doing in different economies, different countries. And the United States was consistently ranking much lower than places like Costa Rica, where people have less income or lower income, but they have a different quality of life. There is investment in economics and infrastructure and quality of life that creates subjective well-being, which I think is a form of collective social capital. If there's a measurable difference in the way people are living, and it can be linked to specific economic, obviously, and social political conditions as well. So I'm referring to the validity of the term, not so much in an academic way, but a useful way to think about what it does mean to invest in human capital and social capital. So it's an interesting conversation that calls for rigor in terms of really motivating those people that are in the position to invest things like money to or support education to do so.
Yeah, and that certainly is part of the benefit of the concept, is that it is capable of communicating that. I think that it's very easy for policymakers and decision makers to understand that, hey, if we do these things, then we can improve this stock, this potential that can have ongoing and lasting benefits. So that is, to me, that is certainly one of the benefits of social capital. And the logic of investment, I mean, the word investment is a very economic kind of term that carries a lot of ideological baggage, but it is what we do. When we go and we meet people and we build friendships, we are effectively investing. We are spending time in a process that is creating a future benefit. Feels a little bit dirty in a way to call that a capital, because it seems to weaken and instrumentalize relationships but it is what it is. Like, we are building a potential. When we build relationships, when we build social structures and groups and organizations, all of these things are all an investment that create a potential.
And I want to take this moment to give a shout out to Riane Eisler, who was the first thought leader, thinker, culture change person who identified the work of the people that take care of children, the free work that is done in the economy by family members to care for other family members or to care for neighbors, as having a true form of economic impact that is unrecognized. And so it would be nice to develop the concept sufficiently that could also be something that we could elevate more in our thinking about what it means to be a civilized society.
Yeah. Well.
All right, so that's a good idea. Include unpaid caretaking as a form of capital. And the whole idea seems to bring up the notion of positive externality, which isn't discussed very much, whereas negative externalities get a lot of discussion. Or you might say surplus. The thing that occurs, I think that it may be easiest in a way to think of social capital as a property of a nation. And I can see some nations like Finland and Taiwan very aggressively building social capital in a way that almost nobody else is, because they happen to be very small countries next to very aggressive countries that would like to take them over. So it's a rather smart thing to do. But social capital of a nation of like the United States, for example, can get problematic because, because of immigration. And then, we built it, they're going to take it. That's the conversation, which makes me think, well, what if we had been more considerate of the social capital of our neighbors in South America? Maybe we wouldn't have so much of a problem. We were kind of the opposite of considerate of their social capital.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I think that at a national level, we can certainly think about social capital and the way in which particularly coordinating institutions can start to set the framework for the kinds of beliefs and attitudes within society that can then represent a potential for pro-social action. And these are things that change over a fairly long period of time, but they're clearly really important things. These are the collective properties of what social capital is. And I think, like, not to dig too much into the mechanisms of how social capital can operate from different, pluralistic perspectives, like we were talking about before, but there is a tendency to believe that if we have an in-group, then there must be an out-group. If people are similar, then they will get along and they'll engage in those commonalities, and that will create a potential for positive social action. But that is at the expense of whoever's not in that group and people who are different. And I don't think that's true. There may be an inherent psychological predisposition for people to do that, to see people outside of the group as not deserving our empathy. But that doesn't have to happen. And I think that a country, like you mentioned, some of the countries in Europe are very capable of creating an us and also the outsiders as being seen as deserving empathy and building social capital on a multi-group level rather than just within the group. Whereas some other countries perhaps aren't quite so good at that because they don't think in that kind of way. They focus more on it's us against whoever's not in the group. One other comment on that, Professor Lyndon Robertson's done some really interesting work looking at the way in which shared antipathy for people can actually be a form of what he calls cheap social capital, that people can come together and engage in collective action as a way to unify against people who they don't have empathy for. And so there's many ways in which this can manifest.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, thanks. Hi, Tristan. Thanks for your talk. I've been thinking about social capital in different aspects. My background is predominantly management and organizational change and transformation. I tend not to think about capital only as a stock. And so I'd like to kind of know your perspective about how to expand the concept of capital, because economic capital is something that can be abstracted, right? And social capital is not as easily abstractable. I mean, you can't, it's non-fungible. And then capital can be used, and I mean, that's what we're seeing in the financial aspect of our economy. Capital is just being transferred and abstracted constantly. So I'm not sure how the concept relates to this aspect of how we've been, accustomed to capital in general. And so wondering if, it's more like a capacity that we have as human, and it has various qualities and aspects and dimensions, if you will, that makes it, that gives it the kind of quality of what we tend to think of what capital does, like stock and reserve surplus, or means of production or means of enabling a certain outcome. So what do you think about this concept more broadly?
Yeah, I think you make some good points. There has been an attempt in the literature, a very, very small attempt in the literature to use the term social capabilities. And there's perhaps a variety of other terms that have been attempted to use instead of social capital. But we're talking about, 0.01%, tiny proportion of the literature, and it hasn't made any significant headway or ground, and social capital continues to barrel along as the dominant concept in this space. And there's others as well, concepts like social value, social capabilities, social infrastructure, social investment. There's a lot of different concepts or terms that people have tried to use because of the objection to the word capital. So I think if we dig in and explore a little more about the process within which social capital works and what are the essential requirements to be able to call itself capital. And one of them is that social capital is an input in production. It is one of those ones that was not recognized in the early days of capital expansion. We tended to focus on factories, and then we realized, oh, hang on, we better include the natural resources that go into factories as well. Oh, hang on, people need to operate these factories as well, so we better include that as in the means of production. And now we're saying, actually, people not only need to be able to input their labor, they need to be able to work together and cooperate with each other to be able to achieve the levels of productivity we want in our means of production. And so therefore, in that perspective, social capital is seen as an input in the means of production like other forms of capital, although of course it's a little bit different as well. So the issue of transferability or fungibility of social capital is also one that comes up fairly often. And it's certainly true that you can't sell your social capital, but you can transfer it to some extent. And you can certainly make use of it in a way that transforms other forms of capital. I can use, as it sounds very instrumental, but I can use my social capital to get access to physical capital that I don't possess. I can call upon my friend and ask if I can borrow her car. I can call my friend who is an engineer and I can ask him specialist human capital skills and information that he possesses, and I can get access to that. So social capital very much does enable the mobilization of various forms of capital and does transform these other forms of capital like most forms of capital do. A factory mobilizes forms of capital and transforms it. It takes natural capital, human capital, so forth, and makes a car as one example. And so we can see there's a huge number of similarities here between the different forms of capital with social capital. But we also do need to acknowledge that there are some pretty significant differences as well, like its transferability as being one of those things. And so if we take the very narrow classical meaning of capital, social capital does not fit. But if we see how the meaning of capital has broadened and changed over time, then I think most people by now are pretty comfortable with it being a form of capital.
Yeah. Jack.
Yes, thank you very much for this talk. I've taken a lot of notes here, even though I know I just got your guide as well, but I think better when I can write what's being said. I'm a historian and a historian of the pre-modern world, in other words, prior to the 19th century. And basically in the period 1400 to 1800. And for reasons that you pointed out when talking about the history of the development of the concept, it fits really nicely into what we often do when working on the history of the period. Just yesterday, I participated in the permanent seminar of a seminar based at a university in Seville in Spain. And we were talking particularly about this in relation to how elite members of Hispanic communities on both sides of the Atlantic had to deal with secret investigations of them if they wanted to achieve certain honors, and then where people would come and testify in secret, which you can imagine how nerve-wracking that was, and how they relied on having people who would come and testify that there were no Jews in their background, no one who'd ever run a retail store, et cetera, and go privately to people who might say otherwise and suggest, well, maybe they didn't really want to go and participate in this process. But in your sort of rolling assessment of publications that use the concept, history started out very low to begin with. And if I could follow that rapid movement, largely dropped out by the end. And you may not have an answer to this question, but I don't understand why.
I'm not sure I do have an answer to it. Yeah, I believe it did drop out out of the top 25, but that may still mean there was hundreds and possibly by now even thousands of publications within history that do represent it. And the other possibility too, and it's a limitation of that particular data set, is that they are Web of Science topics. And so if history was represented by several different topics, then they could each individually occupy a place in the top 100, but not any one of them be in the top 25. So that's a possibility that we'd need to explore in a little bit more detail to understand what's going on. But one other thing I'd like to say about this is that social capital, because of its difficulties and its criticism and its struggle for legitimacy, has to some extent come in and out of disciplines over time. You know, it's been readily adopted and exploded within a discipline in popularity, and then there's been a bit of a crisis of legitimacy, and then it's become out of favor, and it's perhaps declined in its popularity, only sometime later to come back again. So that sort of thing may also be going on within history, but we need to dig into the literature more to understand it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, yeah, again, I'm struck with not a very focused question, but as some people in this group know, I spend a lot of time advocating what we call a new paradigm for economics. It's based on a combination of complex system science and evolutionary science, and it really is a different configuration. So it does qualify as another integrative framework. And it will be fascinating as we move forward, I would love to present that to you and just to see how that interacts with the way that you're with this whole framework. So I can look forward to that and to continuing to interact with you. And I guess to be a little more focused, I'd like to focus on ways of thinking that are not transactional. And so, I mean, often if somebody really has a pro-social mentality, then they are selfless in a sense. They do have the higher good in mind. They do use words such as sacred and worship. They basically, they think and act, I'm part of something larger than myself. I exist to serve it. I willingly subordinate my narrow self-interest to it. I want to help you for its own sake. And I'm just wondering what if that's the worldview, how the concept of capital fits in general terms, and how social capital fits in as a form of capital. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I certainly have lots of thoughts about that. It continues to be one of the big challenges that, especially when you talk about social capital at the individual level, people tend to start thinking about it being transactional. And as soon as you start thinking about it being transactional or instrumental or based on self-interest, you undermine the value of the concept and the potential for future pro-social action. And this continues to be a major challenge as I see it. The challenge doesn't exist quite so much at the collective level because we're not focused so much on transactions, but we're focused on creating the kinds of values and beliefs that encourage, that create the predisposition for people to simply give. Not to give transactionally, not to give in an exchange, but just simply to give, to help, to care for other people. So it's less of a concern and consideration. But it continues to be, if you tie it to capital and people start thinking about what they can get for themselves, then you run into problems, basically. And I want to reflect personally on how this concept has changed my life over the last 20 years. Like, I now give of myself without any thought of return in a way that I didn't know was possible before. And I can only really attribute that to the concept of social capital and thinking about the importance of this in so many different ways. You know, it doesn't come from a religious basis. It doesn't even come from a moral basis, or maybe there's some reasoning there that perhaps is intertwined with it. But when people come to understand what social capital is, why it's important for individuals and for collectives, then it gives people an opportunity to start reprioritizing the things that they do in their life. Ideally, they become more trustworthy, they become more giving, they put collective interests above their own a little bit more because they understand just how important this is for society and for themselves. But that in itself needs to be balanced. You know, that ends up being the conflict or the contradiction that must continually be reconciled. Because if you do focus too much on self-interest, then you lose it. If you focus too much on collective interest, then perhaps it also undermines the value of the concept as well. So I think everything that you said, I agree with.
Wow, that's great. I don't know if that's the great way to end. We're actually at 7:30, so so maybe that's the perfect ending. I can't imagine a better ending than that. So okay, so Anna, do you want to have a final word or?
Yeah, I guess just thank you so much, Tristan, for presenting to us. And as a behavioral scientist, I gotta say, I really appreciate hearing all of your all of the insights into social capital. And thank you everyone else for attending tonight, or whatever time it is where you are.
Okay,
Thank you,
great. And
everyone.
this is, oh, I should say that now there's a seminar every week. Every week there's something like this on Fridays, alternating between noon and 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, to accommodate different schedules and time zones. So put it on your calendar for every week, and a wide range of topics, but all from a evolutionary perspective, this view of life. So anyhow, that's great. And so we'll see some of you next week. And then, of course, there's the cafe alternating between the formal seminar, which is a relaxed atmosphere. Often we have a theme or not. We just kind of hang out the way you do at a cafe. So that's 2 events every Friday that I recommend to everyone. So, all right. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
It's been my pleasure.
Okay.
If you are interested in social capital, the International Social Capital Association also runs webinars, and everyone's welcome to take part in those.
Great.
Thank you so much, Tristan. The link is in the chat for our calendar of events with the upcoming seminars. And thank you again. This will be available on our YouTube channel in just a few days.
All right.
Yeah. Wondering, Tristan,